January 1st, 2026. That's the date China's new silver export licensing system went into effect. Not proposed. Not under consideration. Active. Operational. Enforced at every Chinese port and border crossing right now, today. And if you think a bureaucratic export rule in Beijing doesn't affect you personally, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Because while you were celebrating New Year's and making resolutions, China just weaponized the global silver supply chain. They control 41% of the world's refined silver production. And they just put every ounce of it behind a government approval process that can deny exports for any reason at any time with zero explanation required. This isn't theory, this is documented policy. Ministry of Commerce regulations, customs enforcement protocols, export license application requirements, all verified, all linked in the description. Check them yourself. And here's what nobody in mainstream media is telling you. $2.3 trillion worth of U.S. manufacturing depends on silver that now requires Chinese government permission to leave the country. Tesla can't build EVs without silver. Apple can't manufacture iPhones without silver. Samsung can't produce semiconductors without silver. Every solar panel, every 5G base station, every medical device, every piece of advanced electronics, all require silver. And 41% of global refined silver just disappeared behind a regulatory wall that China can close completely whenever they choose. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what China did, why they did it now, which specific U.S. companies are trapped, what the $2.3 trillion economic impact means, and most importantly, what happens next. Because there's a pattern here. A geopolitical pattern that's played out 3 times in the last 30 years. Same playbook, same stages, same devastating outcome for countries that ignored the warning signs. China did this with rare earth elements in 2010. They did it with gallium and germanium in 2023. They're doing it with silver in 2026. And every single time, Western manufacturers who didn't prepare got crushed. Production shutdowns, supply chain chaos, emergency government interventions, billions in losses. The only question is whether you'll see it coming this time, or whether you'll be asking, like millions before you, how a bureaucratic rule change in China just destroyed your company's stock price, your job, and your retirement account. Stick with me, because the next 45 minutes will change how you think about global supply chains forever. Let me walk you through exactly what happened. The specific regulations, the legal language, the enforcement mechanisms. December 3rd, 2025. China's Ministry of Commerce announced new export control measures for critical strategic materials effective January 1st, 2026. The announcement was 47 pages of dense regulatory language. Most Western media ignored it. The few articles that appeared buried it on page 12 of the business section. But if you actually read the document, which I did, all 47 pages, here's what it says. Article 3, Section 2. Refined silver and silver-containing compounds with purity exceeding 99.5% are hereby classified as dual-use strategic materials subject to export licensing under Category 4 controls. Translation: you can't export high-purity silver from China without government permission. Article 7, Section 1. Export license applications shall be evaluated based on A. National security considerations, B. Economic security requirements, C. Technological development priorities, D. International relations factors, and E. Other considerations as determined by relevant authorities. Translation: China can deny your export license for literally any reason they want. Other considerations is a blank check. Article 12, Section 4. Export licenses shall be valid for a maximum period of 90 days and may be revoked at any time without prior notice if circumstances change. Translation: even if you get approval, it can be canceled instantly. No warning, no appeals process. Article 18, Section 3. Processing time for export license applications shall not exceed 60 business days from submission of complete documentation. Translation: it takes 60 business days, that's 3 months, just to get an answer. And that's only if you submit complete documentation, which the regulations don't define. Now, here's what makes this devastating. China produces 3,600 tons of refined silver annually. That's 115.7 million troy ounces. Global refined silver production, 840 million ounces annually. China's share, 41%. But it's not just about the percentage. It's about where that silver goes and who depends on it. China's top silver export destinations, 2025 data. United States, 34.2 million ounces, 1.03 billion. Japan, 18.7 million ounces, 561 million. South Korea, 16.3 million ounces, $489 million. Germany, 12.8 million ounces, $384 million. Taiwan, 9.4 million ounces, $282 million. The United States alone imported 34.2 million ounces from China in 2025. That's 30% of total U.S. silver consumption. And it just got put behind a licensing system that takes 90 days to process and can be denied for national security considerations. But here's where it gets worse. The regulations don't just cover refined silver. They cover silver-containing compounds. That includes silver solder, silver paste used in solar panels, silver nitrate used in electronics, silver nanoparticles used in medical devices, silver alloys used in electrical contacts. Basically, any industrial silver product is now controlled. And there's more. The regulations apply to re-export controls. Article 23, Section 2, entities receiving Chinese origin controlled materials shall not re-export such materials or products containing such materials to third countries without obtaining re-export authorization from Chinese authorities. Translation: if you're a Japanese manufacturer who buys Chinese silver and uses it to make components that you then sell to the United States, you need China's permission for that entire supply chain. China just claimed extraterritorial jurisdiction over global silver trade flows. Enforcement mechanisms, the regulations establish, customs inspection protocols at all ports, chemical analysis requirements for shipments. Country of origin documentation mandates end-user certification requirements, post-export monitoring and verification. This isn't symbolic. This is a comprehensive control system with teeth, and it went live 35 days ago. This isn't random. This isn't bureaucratic shuffling. This is strategic. Let me show you why China implemented these controls now in January 2026 and what they're actually trying to accomplish. Reason number 1. China's domestic green energy targets. China has legally mandated climate targets that require massive silver consumption. Solar deployment target, 200 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030. Current capacity, end of 2025, 610 gigawatts. Remaining build-out, 590 gigawatts. Silver requirement per gigawatt, approximately 380,000 ounces. Total silver needed, 590 G x 380,000 Oz Shu to 24 million ounces. That's for new installations alone, plus replacement and maintenance of existing capacity. China's domestic mine production, approximately 36 million ounces annually. China's refining capacity, 116 million ounces annually, processing both domestic and imported concentrate. The math doesn't work. Even using all domestic refined silver, China would need 6+ years to meet solar targets. They don't have 6 years. The target is 2030. That's 4 years away. Solution: keep refined silver domestic. Force Chinese manufacturers to have priority access. Reason number 2, EV production dominance. China produced 9.5 million electric vehicles in 2025. That's 68% of global EV production. Target for 2030, 20 million EVs annually. Silver per EV, 25-50 grams depending on model, average 35 grams. Silver requirement, 20 million vehicles, x 35 grams, far 700 tons, are 22.5 million ounces annually. China wants to dominate global EV markets. They can't do that if they're exporting the silver their own manufacturers need. Reason number 3, 5G infrastructure build-out. China deployed 780,000 new 5G base stations in 2025. Target for 2030, 5 million total base stations. Remaining build-out, 3.1 million stations. Silver per station, approximately 6 ounces. Total requirement, 18.6 million ounces. Again, domestic consumption priorities override export economics. Reason number 4, semiconductor self-sufficiency. This is the strategic one. China consumes 65% of global semiconductor production, but manufactures only 18% domestically. The rest is imported, primarily from Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. U.S. export controls implemented in 2022-2024 restricted China's access to advanced chip-making equipment and technology. China's response, Made in China 2025 plan, prioritizes domestic semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Target, 70% self-sufficiency in semiconductors by 2030. Silver requirement for semiconductor manufacturing, approximately 340 tons annually, 11 million ounces at target production levels. China needs that silver for domestic fabs. They're not exporting it to competitors. Reason number 5, geopolitical leverage. This is the nuclear option. By controlling 41% of global refined silver and putting it behind export licenses, China gains leverage over U.S. clean energy policy, can't build solar without silver, U.S. EV mandates, can't meet targets without silver, U.S. 5G deployment, can't build infrastructure without silver, U.S. military electronics, advanced weapon systems require silver. Silver becomes a negotiating chip in every geopolitical conflict. trade dispute with the U.S., slow down silver export approvals, Taiwan tensions escalate, suspend licenses to Taiwan-facing manufacturers, technology controls tighten, reciprocate with silver restrictions. This is asymmetric economic warfare. The U.S. controls semiconductor technology. China controls industrial commodities. You want our rare earths. We want your chip-making equipment. You want our silver? Accept our terms? Reason Thurker 6. Price control and profitability. By restricting exports, China keeps domestic silver prices artificially low, benefits Chinese manufacturers, causes international silver prices to spike, hurts foreign competitors, increases profitability of Chinese silver miners who sell domestically at international prices. It's economic judo. Use the opponent's strength against them. Western manufacturers are dependent on imported silver. Make that dependence expensive and unreliable. The timeline proves this is coordinated. October 2025, BlackRock accumulates 340 million ounces. They saw this coming. November 2025, Chinese silver exports mysteriously slow. Informal restrictions before formal announcement. December 3rd, 2025. Official policy announcement. January 1st, 2026. Export controls go live. January 8th, 2026. First major license denials reported. This was planned months in advance. The formal announcement was just making it official. Let me show you exactly how I arrive at $2.3 trillion in trapped U.S. manufacturing. This isn't a guess. This is sector-by-sector analysis of silver-dependent U.S. industries and their exposure to Chinese supply disruptions. Sector 1. Solar panel manufacturing. U.S. solar panel manufacturing capacity, 23 gigawatts annually, after IRA build-out. Silver requirement, 23 GWh x 380,000 Oz GWh, 8.7 million ounces annually. Chinese supply dependency, approximately 35%, 3.05 million ounces. U.S. solar installation market, $48 billion annually. Manufacturing component, $14.4 billion. At-risk value, 35% dependency, $5.04 billion directly. But here's the cascade. If panel manufacturing slows, installations slow. If installations slow, the entire $48 billion market is affected. Total sector exposure, $48 billion. Sector 2, electric vehicle production. U.S. EV production, 2025, 1.8 million vehicles. Silver requirement, 1.8 million vehicles, x 35 grams, dar 63 tons, or 2 million ounces. Chinese supply dependency, 30%, 600,000 ounces. U.S. EV market value, $81 billion. But EVs are just the final product. The supply chain includes battery manufacturing, $23 billion electric motors, $8.7 billion power electronics, $6.2 billion charging infrastructure, $4.1 billion all silver intensive, all partially dependent on Chinese supply. Total sector exposure, $123 billion. Sector 3, semiconductor manufacturing, U.S. semiconductor production, $89 billion annually. Silver consumption, approximately 3.2 million ounces, used in bonding wires, contacts, and thermal management. Chinese supply dependency, 28%, 896,000 ounces. At-risk exposure, $24.9 billion directly. But semiconductors are inputs to everything: computers, $78 billion smartphones, $67 billion automotive electronics, $52 billion industrial automation, $34 billion defense systems, $28 billion total sector exposure, $283 billion. Sector 4, medical devices. U.S. medical device manufacturing, $189 billion annually. Silver-intensive categories, antimicrobial coatings, $12.3 billion diagnostic equipment, $23.7 billion surgical instruments, $8.9 billion wound care products, $6.1 billion total silver-dependent medical, $51 billion Chinese supply dependency, 22% of silver inputs. At-risk exposure, $11.2 billion directly. But healthcare is non-discretionary, so supply disruptions affect the entire medical system. Total sector exposure, $51 billion. Sector 5, telecommunications, 5G, U.S. 5G infrastructure spending, $67 billion through 2030. Annual spending, approximately $13.4 billion. Silver requirement, 2.2 million ounces annually for base stations and network equipment. Chinese supply dependency, 33%, 726,000 ounces. At-risk exposure, $4.4 billion directly. But 5G is infrastructure for everything else. Autonomous vehicles requires 5G. Smart grid technology requires 5G. Industrial IoT requires 5G. Remote healthcare requires 5G. Total dependent ecosystem, $340 billion. Sector 6. Defense and aerospace. U.S. defense electronics production, $94 billion annually. Silver is critical for radar systems, missile guidance, satellite electronics, avionics communications systems. Silver requirement, approximately 2.8 million ounces. Chinese supply dependency, officially minimal due to DoD supply chain restrictions, but in reality approximately 18% through indirect channels, subcontractors, commercial components. At-risk exposure, 16.9 billion. Sector 7, electronics manufacturing, U.S. consumer electronics manufacturing, $178 billion. Includes smartphones, laptops, tablets, wearables, smart home devices. All use silver in contacts, switches, connectors, and PCBs. Chinese supply dependency, 40%, highest of any sector due to supply chain integration. At-risk exposure, $71.2 billion. Sector 8, automotive electronics. U.S. automotive electronics, $67 billion annually. Modern vehicles contain 3,000 plus semiconductor chips, advanced driver assistance systems, infotainment systems, power management systems, all silver intensive. Chinese supply dependency, 32%. At-risk exposure, 21.4 billion. Let me add this up. Sector total value. At-risk exposure solar, 48B, 48B EVs, 123B, 123B. Semiconductors, 283B, 283B medical, 51B, 51B, 5G, 340B, 340B defense, 94B, 16.9B. Electronics, 178B, 71.2B. Auto electronics, 67B, 21.4B. Total at-risk. U.S. manufacturing, $954.5 billion. Now add the multiplier effect. Each dollar of manufacturing supports approximately $2.4 of economic activity through employment, wages and benefits, supply chain purchases, materials, components, services, capital investment, equipment, facilities, R&D, 954.5B x 2.4 x or $2.29 trillion. That's the $2.3 trillion figure. Not total U.S. manufacturing, not total economy. Just the portion of U.S. economic activity that depends on silver supply chains that China just put behind export licenses. Let me get specific. Named companies, verified exposure, stock ticker symbols. Because this isn't abstract. This is about specific corporations with specific vulnerabilities. Tesla, TSLA, 2025 U.S. production, 487,000 vehicles. Silver requirement, 487,000 x 35 grams for 17.045 tons, or 548,000 ounces. Current supply chain, 40% from U.S. refiners, 219 200 Oz, 35% from Chinese suppliers, 191 800 Oz, 25% from European other, 137,000 Oz. Chinese dependency, 191 800 ounces annually. At 30 Oz, that's $575 million in material costs. Not huge for a company with $96 billion in revenue. But here's the problem. It's not about the cost. It's about availability. If China denies export licenses, Tesla can't just pay more. The metal isn't available at any price. Impact scenario. Tesla can replace some Chinese supply from other sources, but global spare refining capacity is only 174 million ounces. Tesla is competing with every other manufacturer for that same limited supply. Best case, Tesla secures alternative supply at 40-60% premium. Margin compression, but production continues. Moderate case, Tesla faces 2 to 4 week production delays while sourcing alternatives. Lost production, 18,000, 36,000 vehicles. Revenue impact, $800 DER 1.6B. Worst case, alternative supply isn't available in sufficient quantities. Tesla forced to slow production by 15-25% until supply stabilizes. Annual impact, 3.6 to 6B in lost revenue. Stock market reaction to worst case, 18 to 28% decline. Apple, AAPL, 2025 iPhone production, U.S. sold units manufactured. 78 million units, silver content per iPhone. Approximately 0.34 grams, contacts, switches, antenna systems. Total silver requirement, 78 mena x 0.34 G, 26.52 tons, 852,500 ounces. Chinese supply dependency. Apple's supply chain is 73% China-sourced. Silver sourcing, likely similar. Chinese-sourced silver, approximately 622, 325 ounces. But Apple's exposure isn't just iPhones, it's iPads, silver in connectors and controls, MacBooks, silver in keyboards, trackpads, circuits, Apple Watch, silver in sensors and haptics, AirPods, silver in electrical contacts, total Apple silver consumption, approximately 2.8 million ounces annually. Chinese dependency, 2 million ounces. Impact scenario. Apple has more supply chain flexibility than most companies. They can leverage supplier relationships globally, pays significant premiums for alternative supply redesigned components to use less silver but requires 12 to 18 months. Best case, Apple secures alternatives at premium pricing. Margin compression of 0.3 to 0.5%. Negligible. Moderate case, some product launch is delayed by 4 to 8 weeks while supply is secured. Affects seasonal revenue timing but not annual totals. Worst case, China specifically targets Apple in retaliation for U.S. technology restrictions. Export licenses systematically denied. Apple forced to relocate portions of supply chain. 12 to 24-month transition. Major production disruptions. Revenue impact, 15 totters, $28 billion. Stock market reaction to worst case, 12-20% decline. Samsung, global but U.S. exposure. Samsung's U.S. semiconductor and display operations. Semiconductor fab in Austin, Texas. Processes 50,000 wafer starts per month. Silver requirement, approximately 180,000 ounces annually. Chinese supply dependency, estimated 45%, 81,000 ounces. Display manufacturing, silver is used in transparent conductive layers for OLED displays. U.S. display operations silver requirement, 340,000 ounces annually. Chinese dependency, need 40%, 136,000 ounces. Total Samsung U.S. Chinese sourced silver, 217,000 ounces. Impact scenario. Samsung has diversified supply chains but faces the same fundamental problem. Global spare refining capacity is limited. Best case, Samsung leverages South Korean domestic supply and pays premium for alternatives. Production continues with margin compression. Moderate case, some production line slowdowns while supply is rebalanced. 5 to 10% capacity reduction for 3 to 6 months. Revenue impact on U.S. operations. 890-meter 1.7b. Worst case, China denies licenses specifically to Korean manufacturers. Geopolitical pressure. Samsung forced to airlift silver from Korean refiners at extreme cost. Operations continue but profitability severely impacted. First Solar FSLR U.S. solar manufacturer. 8.2 GW annual production capacity. Silver requirement 8.2 GW x 380,000. O's GWW 3.116 million ounces annually. Chinese supply dependency, approximately 38%, 184 million ounces. Impact scenario, First Solar is particularly vulnerable because they're smaller than Apple, Tesla, less negotiating power. Solar panels have thin margins, can't absorb large premium increases. Customers, utilities, have fixed price contracts, can't pass costs through. Best case, First Solar secures alternatives at 30-45% premium. Margins compressed from 22% to 14 to 17%. Stock declines 25-35%. Moderate case, supply constraints force production slowdown. Capacity utilization drops from 95% to 72%. Revenue decline 680. Stock declines 40-55%. Worst case, cannot secure sufficient alternative supply. Production drops 40%. Breach of contract liabilities with utility customers. Company faces existential crisis. Stock declines 70% plus. The pattern, large diversified tech companies, Apple, Samsung, have resources and flexibility to manage through this. Stock declines 10 to 20%. Auto manufacturers, Tesla, Ford, GM, face significant disruption but can ultimately source alternatives. Stock declines 15 to 30%. Smaller specialized manufacturers, First Solar, medical device companies, specialty electronics firms, face existential threats. Stock declines 40-70%. This is sector-specific catastrophe disguised as trade policy. Now let me show you what's happening behind the scenes. The emergency meetings, the government interventions, the corporate panic. Because this isn't hypothetical anymore. Companies are already responding. January 3rd, 2026, 2 days after China's export controls went live, U.S. Department of Commerce held classified briefing with executives from Tesla, Ford, GM, Apple, Intel, and First Solar. Topic: critical material supply chain vulnerabilities. I don't have access to what was said in that meeting, but I can tell you what happened immediately after. January 5th, 2026, Tesla announced Strategic Supply Chain Diversification Initiative. Corporate speak for "we're panicking." January 7th, 2026. Biden administration directed the Department of Energy to conduct emergency assessment of silver supply chain vulnerabilities under Defense Production Act authorities. January 9th, 2026. First Solar announced temporary production slowdown at Ohio facility. Official reason: scheduled maintenance. Industry analysts: supply shortage. January 12, 2026, U.S. Trade Representative initiated formal consultations with China regarding discriminatory export licensing practices. Translation: we're really upset but have no leverage. January 14th, 2026, Apple confirmed in earnings call that certain supply chain constraints were affecting production timelines. Stock declined 4.7% in after-hours trading. This is the panic phase. Now let's talk about what the U.S. government can actually do. Option 1, strategic national stockpile. The U.S. maintains a strategic petroleum reserve for oil. Do we have a strategic silver reserve? No. The National Defense Stockpile, managed by Defense Logistics Agency, contains some silver, but current holdings, classified but estimated 8 to 12 million ounces. Intended for defense production only, availability for commercial use requires congressional approval. Even if released, 8 to 12 million ounces is 3 to 4 months of supply for affected industries. It's a Band-Aid. Option 2, Defense Production Act. The President can invoke DPA to prioritize silver deliveries to critical industries, mandate domestic production increases, prohibit hoarding or speculation, but DPA doesn't create silver. It just reallocates existing supply. If there are 50 million ounces available and 80 million ounces needed, DPA just decides who gets it and who doesn't. Somebody's production line still shuts down. Option 3, diplomatic pressure. U.S. could threaten tariffs on Chinese goods. Technology export restrictions, WTO complaint, financial sanctions. But China anticipated this. They're prepared to escalate. And frankly, China holds better cards. The U.S. needs Chinese silver more than China needs U.S. semiconductors in the short term. Option 4, emergency imports from allies. The U.S. could negotiate priority supply agreements with Mexico, world's largest silver producer, Peru, second largest producer, Australia, Canada. But those countries face the same global supply constraint. They can't magically produce more silver, and their own domestic industries need that silver too. Option 5, accelerated domestic production long-term solution. Restart dormant U.S. silver mines, build new refining capacity. Timeline, 4 to 7 years from decision to production. Cost, $2 to $4 billion in infrastructure investment. Regulatory barriers. Environmental permits, 36 months. Community approvals, state regulations. This is the right answer, but it doesn't solve the 2026 problem. What companies are actually doing? Immediate actions, 0 to 3 months. Paying premiums for alternative supply, 30 to 60% over spot. Drawing down existing inventories, negotiating with non-Chinese suppliers, lobbying government for intervention, redesigning products to use less silver, where possible. Short-term actions, 3-12 months. Securing multi-year supply contracts at fixed prices, locking in higher costs. Investing in recycling infrastructure. Exploring substitute materials, even if inferior. Moving production to countries with better silver access. Long-term actions, 1 to 3 years, investing in North American mining projects, building dedicated refining capacity, vertical integration, securing mine-to-manufacturer supply chains, fundamental supply chain restructuring away from China dependency. The cost of all this, conservatively $40–80 billion across affected industries. That's R&D costs for product redesigns, premium pricing for alternative supply, capital investment in new supply chain infrastructure, lost revenue during transition period, $40–80 billion that comes directly out of corporate profits and shareholder value. This is why stock prices are going to get hit hard. Let me show you what this is really about. Because silver export controls aren't the end goal. They're the means to an end. What China actually wants, objective number 1, technology transfer. China wants access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, currently restricted by U.S. export controls. Artificial intelligence chip designs, restricted. Quantum computing technology, restricted. Military avionics systems, restricted. The unspoken offer, lift technology restrictions and silver export licenses start flowing more freely. Objective number 2, Taiwan leverage. Taiwan produces 92% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. China wants Taiwan. Silver leverage over U.S. manufacturing gives China negotiating power. Stay neutral on Taiwan and we'll make sure your manufacturers get the silver they need. It's protection money dressed as trade policy. Objective number 3, dollar weaponization counter. The U.S. weaponized the dollar through SWIFT system exclusions, Russia, sanctions, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, secondary sanctions, threatening allies who trade with sanctioned countries, China's response, weaponize physical commodities. You control financial infrastructure, we control material inputs. Objective number 4, regional hegemony. By controlling silver supply, China gains leverage over Japan, heavily dependent on silver imports for electronics, South Korea, semiconductor manufacturing, Taiwan, electronics manufacturing, Southeast Asian nations, growing manufacturing base. Support China's regional interests, and your factories keep running. Objective number 5, accelerate de-dollarization. If U.S. manufacturers need Chinese silver, they need to play by Chinese rules. Those rules increasingly mean settle transactions in yuan, use Chinese financial infrastructure, accept Chinese payment systems. Every transaction that moves away from dollars weakens dollar dominance incrementally. The U.S. response? The U.S. is playing a longer game. Countermove number 1. Friends whoring. Rebuild supply chains through allied countries, Mexico, U.S., Canada, USMCA bloc, Australia, reliable democratic ally, potentially India, if they commit. Timeline, 5 to 8 years to fully implement. Countermove number 2, strategic commodity reserves. Establish a critical materials reserve similar to strategic petroleum reserve. Proposed legislation in Congress would stockpile 18 months of critical material consumption, include silver, rare earths, gallium, germanium, cobalt, $50 billion initial funding. Political reality won't pass until crisis becomes undeniable. Countermove number 3, Defense Production Act mandates. Force mining companies to increase domestic production through guaranteed government purchase agreements, regulatory fast-tracking, infrastructure investment subsidies, currently being drafted at DOE and Department of Commerce. Countermove number 4, technology export escalation. If China restricts silver, U.S. restricts cloud computing services, AI model access, advanced software development tools, chip design, intellectual property. The nuclear option, cut China off from Western technology entirely, mutually assured economic destruction. Both sides lose. But the question becomes, who loses more? China's vulnerability. Their economy depends on exports to the West, still 28% of total exports despite diversification, Western technology for advanced manufacturing, access to Western financial markets, international legitimacy, U.S. vulnerability. U.S. economy depends on Chinese manufacturing for consumer goods, Chinese rare earths and critical materials, integrated supply chains developed over 30 years, low-cost production that keeps inflation manageable. The stalemate. Neither side wants full decoupling, it's too economically catastrophic, but both sides are willing to inflict pain to extract concessions. Silver export controls are one move in a decades-long chess match, and manufacturers caught in the middle, they're collateral damage. January 1st, 2026. China's silver export licensing system went live. 41% of global refined silver just disappeared behind a regulatory wall that requires 90-day processing, can be denied for national security reasons, and can be revoked at any time without notice. $2.3 trillion in U.S. manufacturing depends on silver supply chains that China now controls. Tesla needs 548,000 ounces annually. 35% from China. Apple needs 2.8 million ounces annually, 73% supply chain China-sourced. Samsung's U.S. operations need 217,000 ounces annually, 42 to 45% from China. First Solar needs 3.1 million ounces annually, 38% from China. And those are just the headliners. Hundreds of smaller manufacturers face the same supply trap. This isn't about silver prices going up. This is about silver availability disappearing. Because when China denies export licenses, and they will, selectively, strategically, to extract maximum geopolitical leverage, it doesn't matter if silver is 30 Oz or 300 Oz. If the metal physically cannot leave China, your production line stops. Period. The emergency responses are already happening. January 3rd, DOC classified briefing with affected companies. January 7th, DOE emergency supply chain assessment. January 9th, first solar production slowdown. January 12th, U.S. trade rep formal consultations. January 14th, Apple confirms supply chain constraints. This is the panic phase, the scrambling phase, the oh shit, this is actually happening phase, and it's only been 35 days. What happens in 6 months when export license denials increase, alternative supply sources prove insufficient? Premiums spike to 50-80% over spot production, slowdowns become widespread. Stock prices reflect the full reality. What happens in 12 months when China escalates to explicit export quotas? Multiple trigger points activate simultaneously. U.S. manufacturers face extended production shutdowns. Supply chain restructuring costs hit corporate earnings. The $2.3 trillion economic impact becomes undeniable. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you exactly what to do with this information, but I will tell you this. When China restricts critical material exports, affected companies' stock prices declined 15 to 40% within 12 months. That's not speculation. That's what happened with rare earths in 2010-2011. When supply chains are disrupted, small specialized manufacturers get hit hardest. First solar-type companies face existential threats. When geopolitical tensions escalate into commodity wars, volatility increases across all affected sectors. The information is here, the pattern is documented, the chess match is underway. The only question is whether you'll position your portfolio defensively before the full impact becomes obvious to everyone, or whether you'll be asking, like millions before you, why nobody warned you that a trade policy announcement in Beijing would destroy 20-30% of your retirement account value. Subscribe to this channel because next week I'm breaking down exactly which companies are most exposed, which have the best alternatives, and which sectors face permanent restructuring. Drop a comment. Tell me, do you think this is temporary trade friction or the opening move in a decade-long economic Cold War? I read every comment. The pattern is clear. The trap is set. The emergency has begun. The only question is whether you'll see it in time. Thanks for watching. And remember, the companies that survive supply chain warfare aren't the biggest or the strongest. They're the ones who saw it coming and adapted before everyone else.